Cry for help. Cry of joy. Cry of the infant. Cry of the mother. Cry of the earth. Cry of the times. Cry of terror. Cry of the wind. Cry of woe. Cry of the wolf. Cry of the owl. Cry of the night.
Cry of the darkness. Cry coming up the mountain. Cry rolling away. Cry of the city. Cry of the prairie. Cry of the savannah. Cry of the forest. Cry of the wild beast. Cry of the cock. Cry of dawn. Cry of the ocean. Cry of the dead.
Cry of birth, cry of triumph, cry of pride, cry of the father, cry of war, cry of anguish, muffled cry, mute cry, cry of hope, cry of the arts, cry of the air, cry of the error.
Christ. Cry of Christ. Cry of the cross. Cry of the crowd. Cry of God. Cry of Lucifer. Cry of the fool. Cry of the fighter. Cry of fright. Cry from the desert. Cry from the sister. Cry of the heart.
Cry of the corpse, cry of the minotaur, cry of the matador, cry of pain, cry of distress, cry of deer, cry of hunter, cry of the cave bear, cry of the boar, cry of the blood, cry of the lamb, cry of the sacrifice.
Raw cry, cruel cry, existential cry, cry of the seventh heaven, cry of the Tower of Babel, cry of hell, cry called the swan song, cry of the bald vulture, cry of the royal eagle, cry of Ganymede, cry of the Olympus, cry without echo.
Cry with no response, cry without end, cry of the end, cry of the lost man, cry before defeat, cry before the fall, cry of the falling star, cry of the four continents, cry of the last Mohican, cry of the Mustang, cry of Moby Dick, cry of the Count of Monte Cristo, cry of the Flying Dutchman, cry of the Barbarian, cry of Rimbaud, cry of the cursed poet, cry of the cursed people, cursed cry.
Cry of mourning, cry from the tomb, cry of the catacombs, cry of the high priest, cry of the grand master, cry of the ancestor, cry of the traitor, cry of the martyr, cry of misery, cry of the motherland, cry without reason, cry without voice, cry by Munch, cry of the monk by the shore, cry of mankind, cry of the ass, cry of the soul, cry of man. Cry of woman, cry of Our Lady, cry of the wife, cry of the crazy, cry of Medea, cry of the Medusa, cry of the raft of the Medusa, cry of the Titanic, cry of the invincible Armada, cry of the tempest, cry of divine ire, cry of the lioness of the seas, cry of the wounded animal, cry of the King of Spain, cry of the unknown soldier, cry of the bottom of the sea, cry of the centuries, cry of the seagull.
Cry of the lark, cry of the monarch, cry of nature, cry of the flesh, cry of the lover, cry of satisfaction, penetrating cry, cry of impotence, cry of the mortally ill, cry without breath, cry without family, cry of the age, cry of life, cry of the three virtues, cry of the seven vices, cry of the nine muses, cry of the 12 apostles, cry of the shroud.
Last cry, cry of the crime, cry of the strangler, cry of the rope, cry of the open wound, cry of the broken bones, cry of the battlefield, cry of the sorcerer, cry of the odalisque, cry of the sex, cry of the eunuch, cry of the Queen of Saba, cry of Vivian of the Lake, cry of the image, cry of the idol, cry of the ideal, cry of the minister, cry of the midwife, cry of the unborn, cry of the shipwrecked, cry of the rat, cry of the homeless, cry of the prophet, primitive cry.
Cry of Isaac on the altar, cry of Abraham on Isaac, cry of Judas on the tree, cry of Peter on the waves, cry of John at the grave, cry of the beast of the sea, cry of the 144,000, cry of the great whore, cry of Alexander at Babylon, cry of Caesar at Alexandria, cry of Bonaparte at Moscow, cry of Nebuchadnezzar, cry of Heliogabalus, cry of Goebbels, cry of Adolf and Ava, cry of Anne Frank, cry of Bonifacius, cry of the heathen, cry of the Elysian fields, cry of the angel of Bethlehem, cry of the king of the Orient, cry of the shepherd, cry of the dog, cry of rage.
Cry of love, cry of Psyche, cry of Beatrice, cry of Laura, cry of Mammon, cry of Paul G. on the Isles, cry of Paul C. in the Loaf, cry of Vincent in the Wheat, cry of the bowels, cry of the bowels of the earth, cry of the universe, cry of the future, cry of the past, cry of the spirit, cry of the arms, cry of the tears, cry of shame, cry of the world, cry of the nuptial bed, cry of ecstasy, cry of abandonment, cry of exhaustion, cry of gloom, clear, cry.
Cry of the light, cry of the swallow, cry of the primrose, cry of spring, cry of the egg, cry of the pup, cry of the pope, critical cry, wan cry, white cry, cry of the ant, cry of the epheme, cry of decadence, cry of Sodom and Gomorrah, cry of Lot's wife, cry of Lot's daughter, cry of the slave, cry of the whip, cry of the wreck, unfathomable cry, cry of the source, secret cry, sacred cry, cry of the damned.
Cry of rape, cry of the raped, cry of the lynched, cry of violence, cry of the violin, cry of John Sebastian, cry of Anna Magdalena, cry of Wolfgang Amadeus, cry of Don Juan, cry of Don Quixote, cry of the wandering Jew, cry of Gilgamesh, cry of Hector, cry of the Trojan horse, cry of the Sphinx, cry of Oedipus, cry of incest, cry of the demon, cry of Nero, cry of Agrippina, cry of Cleopatra, cry of the adulterer, cry of chastity, cry of the virgin.
Cry of Krishna, cry of Adam, cry of Beelzebub, cry of Abel, cry of the cannibal, cry of Robinson, cry of Robespierre, cry of Jack the Ripper, cry of Joan of Arc, cry of victory, cry of the victim, cry of the famine, cry of the plague, cry of the scourge, cry of the flames, cry of the waters, cry of the deep, cry of the dream, decry, written cry, lone cry, sad cry, soft cry, simple cry.